Okay, welcome to the September 2019 Green Infrastructure, Climate and Cities seminar series here at Drexel University. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a consortium of partners associated with this seminar series. We've been going on since back in 2014. And again, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the seminars are hosted at Drexel University as part of CC Run, our efforts under the Consortium for Climate Risks in the Urban Northeast, which is a NOAA-funded research project to look at the impacts of climate change in the urban Northeast. Though our speakers often hail from other places, and today we have two speakers joining us through Zoom. We typically have between 1 and 3 speakers per month, and if you're joining us for the first time, our older presentations are all archived on the CC Run website, where they can be downloaded and watched. You're also able to join us remotely, and I understand today there's a significant number of us joined remotely through our Zoom link. So today's topic is water and climate resiliency, and we have two speakers. Nicole Hernandez from the Clean Energy States Alliance and Michael McMahon from HDR. And what we'll do, the format will be each one of our speakers will talk for a few minutes, and then we'll have a little discussion, and then we'll move to the next speaker and have another discussion. Before I introduce the speakers, I just want to mention that next month we are going to be shifting gears a little bit to talk about coastal communities and some of the results of some workshops that we've had looking at the impacts of climate change along our coast. So that's on Wednesday, October 2nd. And I also wanted to mention that within the next few months, those of you who are practicing engineers, land surveyors, architects, will be able, in any of the states that are part of our consortia, will be able to get continuing education credits from your attendance at these workshops. We'll be issuing certificates. So more information on that in upcoming months. So with that introduction, I'd like to introduce Nicole Hernandez, who is a project director for the Clean Energy States Alliance, where she works on low and moderate income solar. She's a well-known climate change expert, sea level researcher, and environmental justice advocate. So Nicole's going to talk to us about her previous work in Miami, where she assessed on-the-ground impacts and leveraged that to mobilize the community to create climate-resilient climate change adaptation initiatives. And so we will start with Nicole's presentation, and then we'll move to Michael McMahon, who works at HDR, his consulting firm, as a scientist and project manager, where his projects include climate change quantification, impact analysis, adaptation, flood warning, and other things. And so Michael's presentation will focus on how innovative, resilient engineering practices create the ability to adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change on water, wastewater, and stormwater sectors. So those are our two presentations today to talk about resiliency. So with that, I'll hand over the screen share to Nicole for our first presentation. So Nicole, if you could share your screen. Okay, your slides are up.
Great. Let me know if you can hear me okay.
Yep, perfectly.
Great, thanks. As was mentioned, I work for the Clean Energy States Alliance, but before I started working for CISA, I was in advocacy, specifically around climate change impacts. And before that, I spent well over a decade in academia. So this is kind of the story of how I transitioned from academia into working in advocacy and education full-time. While I was in academia, I focused a lot on looking at the impacts of sea level rise, specifically on natural systems and urban infrastructure. And And while I was doing that work, Climate Central put out a list of the places that are most vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise. So Miami, of course, New York, coastal Texas, California. And I noticed something about that list. The majority of those places had the largest or fastest growing Latino populations. In fact, I had a lot of family and friends living in those places. And at the time, there was a lot of conversation around the impacts of pollution on communities of color, but not a lot about the impacts of climate change. And it kind of it really struck me, both as a scientist, but also as a Latina. I'm originally from Guatemala, and I grew up in Miami. So I started looking for opportunities to do more outreach, first as a scientist. And so I connected with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and then with a special program from EDF called Moms Clean Air Force. So I started the Moms Clean Air Force Florida chapter. And then I started doing outreach in Miami, in Latino communities, in English and in Spanish, talking about climate change. And for me, that work felt so important because in academia, it's such a long kind of pipeline between the research that you do and when it finally gets into the hands of the communities that need to know about, specifically in this case, the impacts of climate change. And so I made the decision to leave academia, and I started working for UCS. And one of the reports that we worked on was back in 2015 called Encroaching Tides. And it looked at the impact of sea level rise and what we call sunny day flooding, and how it was going to affect the east coast of the US and the Gulf over between 2015 and 2045. So in the time of kind of a mortgage. And what we saw was that in places like Miami that experience about a dozen sunny day flooding events per year, by the year 2045, in Miami in particular, we were going to see 380 sunny day flooding events. So flooding that's not connected with precipitation or storms or anything like that, but just as a result of being very low lying in a time where sea level is going up. And then another report that we worked on was called Surviving and Thriving in the Face of Rising Seas, which focused specifically on frontline communities and communities of color. But I still felt like there was more information and more on the groundwork that could be done to help bring in frontline communities into the discussion of how we begin to adapt to climate change. So I created kind of a simple model, and I kind of mixed advocacy and science. So I said, where are the impacts happening? Not, is it on the East Coast or is it in Miami, but like at the block level? What is the intersection? What is the lowest lying intersection, in this case, in Miami? And then when should I go there? So if we are starting to see sunny day flooding now, where are the places we're going to see that? And when? So I pulled up the NOAA tide charts, and I looked for, I'll go into that, but I looked for the days of the highest tides. And so I came up with a spreadsheet that had the highest tides, the exact time, and the intersection. And then I did ground truthing, which is going to those places at those times and seeing what was happening. And based on what I was seeing, I began to do local outreach with community organizations that were either working on climate change and community education, or working on environmental justice around pollution, or working with frontline communities or low-income communities around issues like immigration and jobs that hadn't been working on climate change. And I kind of brought those different groups together, and we started doing outreach. And then how to, make sure that led to resident-led resilience was kind of the core of that initiative. So I'll kind of walk through what that looked like. So first, I used maps that were accessible to the public. So Climate Central maps, and then specifically Florida International had a sea level rise app. And so that's what I used to look at the lowest lying places. And then here's just kind of a snapshot of the tides chart, which I'm sure many of you have already seen. So I just kind of picked out the highest tides. And then there's that spreadsheet I put together. And what was interesting is I went to Miami Beach, which a lot of folks think of as, you know, you can imagine it's kind of the typical Miami Beach image with the Art Deco buildings and the nightclubs and the beautiful beach. And they were experiencing sea level rise, but they had put at that point already $500 million, $500 million aside to raise roads, to put in pumps, to do public education, to do a variety of adaptation initiatives, which was great. They had a lot of expensive real estate to take care of and a lot of people to take care of and tourism. But just a few miles away in a place called Shorecrest, there was none of that. No money had been put aside, roads weren't being raised, there was no billboard saying that this is sea level rise. Nothing was happening. So I started talking to the residents in that community. And in this picture, that looks like a river, but it's actually a road. There's a truck in the back trying to drive through. I'm speaking to a young man, his name is Jason Robinson. He's a truck driver. And he had an iPad where he put different jobs that he had kind of listed in the routes. And he put that iPad one night under the driver's side of his car, under the seat. And in the morning, as the high tide came in, the water went in under the undercarriage of the car and flooded the inside cabin of the car to the point where the iPad where he had his jobs was damaged and he couldn't go to work. So he was really frustrated and was looking for some support and some help. The other thing is with salt water, it's very corrosive. And so a lot of cars were getting damaged and they were having issues with insurance companies covering that damage. This is Mrs. Escobar. She was really frustrated with the flooding. You can see garbage cans kind of floating and bobbing in the water there. The garbage trucks, because of the corrosive nature of the water, weren't coming down the road to pick up the garbage. So she had to tie garbage bags around her legs, and then she would carry the garbage bags down the flooded street so the garbage could be taken out. And so she started writing the dates of the flooding and her address on pieces of paper, and she would have her daughter take pictures and she would send it to whatever email address she could find on the Miami-Dade government page, and she wasn't getting any responses. So I mentioned I worked with a variety of different organizations. So they included Catalyst Miami, the Clio Institute, the New Florida Majority, and Florida International University, both their sea level rise center, but also working with their journalists. And then Moms Clean Air Force, as I mentioned before. Right around this time, I was invited to be a guest of Michelle Obama's at the 2015 State of the Union for the work that I had been doing in South Florida around climate change and communities of color. And that gave me the opportunity to connect with a lot of reporters, which was great because I was able to reach out to them and bring them down to Miami so they could see the flooding firsthand, they could see what was happening. So Elizabeth Colbert wrote a great piece for the New Yorker. I worked with the folks from Years of Living Dangerously on the National Geographic Channel. The Chris Hayes Show and MSNBC covered it. I was on several interviews with Telemundo, along with the residents, talking about the flooding that we were seeing. The local paper, Miami Herald, was covering the story. And then I did radio, both in English and in Spanish. And then someone from the county called me and asked me to stop doing so much media and to let's work together. So we did. And we had a meeting where we brought in the residents, we brought in local researchers from Florida International University. We worked with the nonprofits. They provided space, they brought food. We made it comfortable for families to come with kids. And what we did is we connected the flooding that people were seeing to the issue of sea level rise, to the bigger picture of climate change. So a lot of times folks say that, you know, your worry pool is full. We have too much to think about when it comes to just kind of day-to-day life. We don't have time to deal with issues like climate change that may not be affecting us now. But when you're talking to folks that are dealing with issues like I'd mentioned that the community members were dealing with around sea level rise or around heat, people are more interested in having those discussions and participating in the solutions. There's Jason speaking. So then we shared these stories with our local elected officials. This is Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo. And I had met with him before as a scientist, and I showed him graphs and charts and numbers and projections, and it was useful and helpful. But he told me, he's like, it's the stories of people, it's these experiences that I need in order to be able to put together a compelling case for addressing climate change. And right around that time, he put together the Bipartisan Climate Change Caucus. So back to Shorecrest. So the city of Miami was very concerned, and they started moving forward, doing an analysis of what could be done. So they created land use maps. They looked at building footprints. They got a sense of the vulnerability of the area. And then they began to design ideas for adaptation, but these designs were done in partnership with the residents. And then they also reached out to the Dutch, who provided some really interesting and creative solutions. So here's a picture of an area of Shorecrest that was flooding. On one side, there's a canal, and on the other side, that's just a sunny day flooding. And then this is how the residents, in partnership with the city, in partnership with the nonprofits, and with information from around the world, kind of designed and envisioned what that area could be. And then we went ahead and piloted this method with heat. So I worked with the folks at FAU, and we created heat maps, and we found the places that had the highest degree of urban heat island. And we went to that place, and we partnered with the American Red Cross, with the Unit of Concerned Scientists, and Mom's Clean Air Force, and then a very well-known local artist that was working on climate change and art projects, and the city of Hialeah. And we brought in residents, and we had presentations that were done in both English and Spanish. So I made sure all the speakers could speak both languages, and every slide that they presented was presented in both languages. And we chose the time based on the NOAA warmest day of the year map, and we went the week before the warmest week of the year in Hialeah. So this is a picture of the heat maps that were based on Landsat or Landsat thermal infrared sensor data. And then afterwards, we had the American Red Cross truck outside giving out information that included cooling centers, health indicators related to heat, and information to contact the Red Cross if folks had questions. And then the artist, Javier Costada, who's amazing, brought a solar panel from his house, and we fried eggs on the solar panel. We made sure to have media there, and Univision covered it. And the city of Hialeah was really happy with how the event went. In fact, it was one of their most successful events that year. So that's it. Any questions?
If there's any online, you have a question?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't live along the coast. I live in Pennsylvania, downtown. And we have had some serious rain bombs, particularly in 2018, but we're having some this year also. And we had one rain in particular that was so heavy that it blew the manhole covers off the storm drain systems in our neighborhood. And I've gone out to some of the municipalities and I asked them if they had any way to predict where, if we get a rain bomb, let's say we get 8 inches of rain in 6 hours or something, where would that water go? Do you have the storm capacity, storm drain capacity to handle that kind of volume? And if you don't, where will the overflow go? What will it damage? Where will it go, and what kind of damage will it do? And I haven't found a single municipality in Chester County yet that has any idea. They have no idea at all. So I've been seeking a computer program kind of model that you could maybe program in. If you know your storm, your stormwater capacity, first of all. But if you know that, and you know that you're going to get X amount of rain in a short period of time, and it's going to exceed that capacity, how can you predict? Is there any way to predict future-wise to where you need to beef up your storm drain systems, where you need to direct that water so that it doesn't damage infrastructure and things like that? And the closest I've found to it is Stroud Water Resources has a program, but it doesn't do quite what I'm looking for there. I'd like to have something that you can plug in the what ifs. What if this happens? That kind of thing. Does anybody know if something like that exists?
Well, I'll tell you what, you're asking question one presentation too early.
All right. Well,
I'll cover that exact question.
I will sit here.
But Nicole, have you used? You mentioned it was very interesting. It's very exciting that you you went to the NOAA tide tables, you went to the lowest lying areas, you just sort of got yourself there right when things would be worse to document this, and then talked to people who gave you the information you needed. It sounds like to create a politically relevant conversation. But what other tools besides sort of like sort of communicating the stories from the ground up? Have there been other tools that you've used in your work in various communities?
Tools for communication?
Well, yeah, like what are your favorite tools? In other words, that was certainly a very effective tool. Is that what you found to be the most effective tool, is sort of taking personal stories about the impacts in certain places at certain times and bringing them to local government leaders? Or how have you sort of, where do you go with this? Like, how do you then take these messages and what do you use? What are the mechanisms you use to sort of create change out of it?
Well, there's a couple of different avenues. So if you're in a place where the local government is involved in addressing these issues, but maybe hasn't connected enough with low-income areas, there generally are opportunities to create those discussions. I think it's really important to think about making sure that community voices are amplified in those discussions. I think sometimes when you bring together community members and academics and government folks, the community members often feel like they can't participate in those conversations. So I think there are several community discussions and tools that can be used. The Climate Justice Alliance has a lot of great information about how to have those conversations. I think basically using the HEMIS principles is really important when you're doing any type of organizing. And I think also just having a different approach, not being extractive with your research, but having kind of a more of a servant mentality, thinking about not your issue and how you can wiggle it into other people's lives, but the other way around, how can the work that you do support community members that need to make decisions, and in a lot of cases, short-term decisions about where they're going to live and what that's going to look like within the life of a mortgage. Some real questions that people are interested. I mean, some people have community meetings and are like wondering why aren't people coming? Well, because it's not really relevant to their lives. And I think, and in those cases, you need to re-examine whether you're targeting the right community, or whether the issue you're looking at is really a an issue the community is, concerned about and needs to address at the moment.
Yep.
Nicole, I'm really inspired to hear the work that you did, and that especially providing a bilingual opportunity for people to express a vision for their future. I think it's really exciting, and I'm curious what you think the future looks like. I'm curious politically, because I heard Corbella lost his seat, which I only heard because he was one of the few Republican congresspeople that was actually climate proactive. Which I think some of the climate thinking Republicans were bummed that he lost his seat. So I'm curious what the political future is of that area. If people feel politically connected, and if they're able to have their voices heard, and also physically, what you think the communities that you worked with, if they'll be able to stay there, if they're talking about what the future next steps are, if they're going to have to retreat or build differently. Just what direction you think they're going?
Well, politically, I think for a lot of folks right now, it's kind of hard to be optimistic. So it's tough, but I'll tell you, I was one of the scientists when I was working at Florida Atlantic University. I was on a grant for the Florida Department of Transportation, looking at the impacts, actually developing a methodology to assess the impacts of sea level rise on Florida's transportation infrastructure. And it was right around the time Governor Rick Scott, now hard to say, but Senator Rick Scott, when he was a governor, right around the time he took office. And I don't know if you all heard, but it was on the news quite a bit where scientists were being gathered, we couldn't say climate change. And when I submitted the first draft of the report to the FDOT project manager, she wrote back and she's like, this is a great, as she called me. She called me, she said, this is a great report, but I need you to take the words climate change out of this as much as you can. And about a year later, I left academia, and that's when kind of the story broke that was happening, not just in FDOT, but in a lot of the different agencies. And so the work was happening, but it was happening on a different place, a different scale. It was happening within the universities while Governor Rick Scott was in office. The Florida Climate Institute, which was all of the major universities in Florida working together on climate change, that came together. The South Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, which was the southernmost counties on the East Coast, so Miami, Broward, where Fort Lauderdale is located, Palm Beach, where Mar-a-Lago is located, and the Keys, all were working together to address climate change, and still are, and doing great things when it comes to adaptation and mitigation. And then a lot of the nonprofits that I mentioned before that were either focused on climate change or on justice issues started working together, and individually on climate and environmental justice projects. The Van Allen Institute is doing some great work in actually developing a lot of these ideas within Miami-Dade counties, and they have a focus on frontline communities, which is great. So a lot can be done locally and regionally when the state or federal policies and decision makers are not in line with climate change. That said, at this point, we know we have a very quickly shrinking window of time for us to take major action on reducing fossil fuels. And so my hope is really in 2020 and hoping that things can change in a way where we'll be able to push the policies at the state and federal level that we need in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Specifically, Jason Robinson, he actually left. He ended up moving to California because he was really frustrated with tidal flooding, and then on top of that, issues related to hurricane and hurricane preparedness, and then heat, because Miami is also one of the places that's most vulnerable to the impacts of heat, that he had enough and he left. And so they're doing a lot of work in Miami along the lines of adaptation, but I think there's also an understanding that there are certain places, especially in the Keys, that are not going to be inhabitable, in our lifetime. And the discussion around retreat is happening, and how do you manage retreat in a way that isn't traumatic, especially to the folks with the least amount of resources. And one of the big things to take into account when you're thinking about that is time. The more time people have to leave, like in the case of Jason, he had time to find other job opportunities and move. But in the case of hurricanes, for example, people don't have a lot of time, and the impacts are much more, and the displacement is much more traumatic. So those are the kinds of discussions that are happening not just in Miami, but in places like Galveston, in the Outer Banks, in coastal Georgia. And they're tough questions to answer, and they're different for every different community. Adaptation and mitigation are certainly not copy-paste exercises, and so there's a lot of work that's involved, and it's so important. I always talk about how when I'm working on a project that involves both community work and science work, it's so much easier for me to bring in someone from the community and get them up to speed on the science than getting a scientist up to date and kind of connected with what the community needs. So I think that we often value scientific knowledge in a certain way, but I think community knowledge is just as valuable. And if we're going to address a wicked problem like climate change, we need to have balanced and representation from all aspects of our communities. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. That was great. If there's,
Is there a question online?
no.
Okay.
But if we don't mind taking a few minutes, I'd love for Nicole to talk about some of her current work that she's starting, which is not water related, but more solar related, right, Nicole? That you were telling me about on the phone. Would you like to take a few minutes to talk about what you're doing right now? Because I thought it was really interesting.
Sure, thanks. So I'm working for the Clean Energy States Alliance that's based in Vermont, but we do work all across the country, and I'm focused on low and moderate income communities and how to make specifically solar more accessible to those communities. I'm working in Rhode Island with the Office of Energy Resources. Rhode Island just started offering community solar, but the legislative side of it is kind of tricky, and we're trying to figure out how can we create savings and create programs and models that make it easy for folks on, for example, light heat benefits or reduced utility rates to be able to participate in projects like community solar projects. And then I am working on a Department of Energy grant that includes 5 states, Minnesota, Oregon, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Mexico, and Washington, D.C., on creating more opportunities for LMI folks to participate in a variety of different types of solar projects. I've been on this project for a year, so we're still kind of pulling all of this together, but I'm really excited for the outcomes of the project. I think for a long time I focused on 90% just getting folks to understand that climate change is happening and how it's affecting us, and then 10% of that conversation was on solutions, and now we're seeing that it's time to kind of flip that around and really be focused more on 90% or 10% about the problem, because we're all hearing it and we're all living with it, and then 90% on solutions. So I've kind of shifted, and that's kind of where I'm coming from now.
I wonder if I could ask you a follow-up question on that, because something that's been interesting for me lately is there seem to be more and more opportunities to talk. I mean, it's still very difficult, but there's more and more opportunities to talk about adaptation, simply because people are flooding, the days are getting hotter, so there are lots of places where adaptation discussions are beginning to happen. But what's fairly ironic to me is that in many of those discussions, it's really a discussion about adapting to a situation that we are simultaneously part of creating, right? In other words, the mitigation discussion often doesn't happen at the same time as the adaptation discussion. It's really interesting that your career, it sounds like you're working both on the adaptation side and on, through the solar, the mitigation side. But I wonder if you have any, you're talking about proportion of, solutions versus science, but if you had to compare your level of optimism or the rate of uptake of, some of your activism in the adaptation world to the mitigation world, do you feel like you make more traction or, get a greater audience when you're focusing on one of those over the other, or about the same?
I found it's useful to lead with adaptation, so starting with impacts. So talking to folks in the time and the place where they're feeling these impacts and explaining what's happening, making those connections, I think is kind of where the conversation should be happening, or at least, where it should be starting. And then the question is, what do we do about it? And that's when we can discuss both adaptation and mitigation. So, how do we deal with what we can't avoid, and how do we prevent the worst? So I find it hard to separate. If you just talk about impacts, then you're not really providing solutions. And if you talk about adaptation, for example, during a Sandy, a superstorm Sandy, there was a lot of beach erosion in Fort Lauderdale, and they replenished the beach, renourished the beach with a caravan of trucks from about, 30, 50 miles away, taking sand from around Lake Okeechobee and as their fossil fuel using vehicles. And there was a caravan of trucks that would drive from Okeechobee down to Fort Lauderdale to put sand on the beach. And so we have adaptation, but we have adaptation that doesn't consider the source of the problem.
Right.
If we're running pumps, and those pumps are running on fossil fuels, we're doing what we need to do to take care of our little piece of, of the world for a little bit longer, or to protect our little piece of the world for a little bit longer, but ultimately we're making it worse for ourselves and for everybody else. So I think that having adaptation without mitigation really is kind of missing the point of what it means to live in a time of climate change.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, Nicole, for your presentation and your discussion. That was great.
Thanks.
So let's switch over now to Michael. Michael, if you could share your screen.
You got it.
All right, we see you. Okay, you're up. Your slides are up.
Good deal. Hey everybody, I'm Lake Fan. I'm the senior hydrometeorologist with HDR Engineering. HDR is the sixth largest engineering and architecture firm in the country. They're based in Omaha, but we have 244 offices worldwide. I am the climate science and resiliency lead in our water business group, but I have found that I get borrowed a lot by transportation and architecture to advise in certain situations. Nicole, I cannot tell you how much I agree with your sentiment regarding the technological and science side of what we do and the policy and advocacy side of what we do. So I spent 22 years with Lockheed and Boeing during operations and research for primarily for aviation, but also worldwide. And during that time, of course, I thought everything could be solved through technology and the science that I was doing. So when I started with HDR 12 years ago and got involved in climate science and resiliency, it was a really tough road to hoe, where it's like, no, it's all about the technology and the work that you do and how good it's going to be for people. But if you can't communicate that and it doesn't get through to the greater populace, it doesn't do anybody any good. So my percentages are a little different than yours, but pretty darn close, where originally I thought it was 75% science and technology and 25% policy and advocacy. It's the other way around. And so much more can be done with policy and advocacy than could be done with any amount of great science. It's just a frustrating situation. So I'm going to segue really quick to Hurricane Dorian, just because it's been my life for the last week. This is a current infrared satellite image of the storm as it slowly moves northwestward at 9 miles an hour. Interesting enough, although Florida was greatly afraid of the impacts of Dorian, it is actually the Carolina coasts that are going to have the greatest impact. The storm center is supposed to end up within 35 miles of the central South Carolina coast, and it is indeed forecast to make landfall over Cape Hatteras as it moves northeastward after it recurves. Staggering damage. It is only a matter of time before this same scene is played out in a large city in the United States. In fact, that is something that actually may happen before the end of this hurricane season is over, because what I'm seeing in the long range forecast has the storm forming off the coast of Africa, ending up along the northeast coast in a very similar pattern as Superstorm Sandy. 2 weeks out right now, but it's showing up in our atmospheric models, and it is something to pay very, very close attention to over time. So in the world that I work in, we are private consultants, generally working for public entities. Nicole, again, I find your perception of what has been going on so spot on, in so much as 10 years ago, when I started having these discussions with clients, it was a tough go. I had to start at square one, and the work that needed to be done to convince them that, yeah, you do need to be proactive at this time versus reactive, and why, was a lot harder discussion than is going now. Now we have three very strong drivers and one overlying tenant that is responsible for our clients coming to us and asking us to help them with their risk and resilience to the impacts of climate change. The first strong driver is the desire to reduce the likelihood of service failure. That is very motivational for somebody that runs a water utility, whether it's wastewater, stormwater, or water supply. They don't want to wake up in the morning and find out that their system is not working anymore, because they tend to get a lot of complaints when that happens. Second, the benefit to cost of resilient actions has become so prominent and so motivating that if utilities don't do that, they are remiss, and they are not doing their job, and they are risking the likelihood of service failure. And then finally, increased liability for not considering potential hazards. This one is the big one now. 5 years ago, I'd reverse that order. And it would be, the primary one would be service failure, cost of benefit, and then increased liability. Now it's that increased liability. And the primary driver, which is very policy driven, is a community that develops awareness of its vulnerabilities and responds by adding resilience to infrastructure services in order to adapt, is increasingly respected by its citizens and becomes more attractive for economic development. So interesting. If there's a policymaker in the room when I'm talking to them about what resiliency means, they get down to that last sentence and they go, oh, you could see it in their face. You could see how it impacts them, because they understand that if they don't do that, they're no longer doing their job either. So I mentioned the fear of service failure. That is truly what keeps general managers up at night, but it's not just the consequences of a single service failure. They are dominoes in the big game of, you've had a hazard, everything went wrong. You want to be the one that has the utility that stays up and running and is doing its job in a scenario like that. National Institute of Building Sciences did a benefit cost of resilient actions study 2 years ago. And this yielded a 6-to-1 ratio of cost to benefit. Now, MIT did a similar study, and they ended up in the 9-to-1 to 11-to-1 range. So it is undoubtedly a very profitable and very good management practices to be proactive rather than reactive. And then finally, a storm is indeed brewing. The Geneva Association, which is basically the think tank for all things insurance worldwide, has addressed climate change in such a way as to indicate that it is one of the highest potential socioeconomic risks to our society. In so saying that it covers all bases. Very interesting, and Nicole, you might be able to appreciate this. I gave a workshop on climate change to 37 different utilities in, drumroll please, North Carolina recently. There wasn't a single climate denier. For all the GMs or lead engineers from these agencies, and they all got it. I showed them a slide and saying, regardless of the fact that the current administration is doing away with water regulations, what's taking its place are civil lawsuits. And I saw so many heads nodding in the room that I laughed. I laughed out loud. And I go, I see you guys understand what I'm talking about. And they're going, oh, 100%. And that's why we're here having this conversation. Here's a fun one. This is a case study that's come up in many recent climate change cases. Hooper was much more than a really bad Burt Reynolds movie. Hooper versus Northern Barge Company, 1932. In this case, the plaintiff argued that the barge company was negligent because and lost their cargo because they failed to use a radio. Well, the barge company said, well, radios are commonplace in our industry right now, so we don't have one. The court ruled that the industry custom wasn't adequate or hadn't evolved as it should have in order to protect the public. Ring any bells for climate change? This case has come up, and it is an excellent example of, no, I know you say that, we didn't know climate change was coming. So from an engineering standpoint, from an HDR standpoint, we have to mention the inclusion of climate change in all of our projects now. Now, 5 years ago, that was a situation where a client would ask for it. Now it's a situation where we ask them if they would like to consider it. And if they don't, they have to sign an agreement that says, no, we don't want to. Kind of a CYA on our part, but also making sure that they know, no, this is a real thing and it needs to be taken care of from a liability standpoint. So again, Nicole, you mentioned something that was so unbelievably important to getting our job done, which is the power of communication and outreach. And that extends to all agencies, political advocates, policymakers. However, something interesting came out of my research of this, in so much as the Water Research Foundation did a study. Said, who do you believe when it comes to climate change impacts on your local water system? Well, lo and behold, water utilities scored pretty darn well. And again, when I show this to water utilities, they're like, oh, so they are listening to us. Yes, and there's a opposite side to this coin, which is related to, of course, to money, in so much as if the water utilities have figured out that if they need something to make their system more resilient, then they can justify it. They can take it to their PUC and say, you know what, we're going to have to raise rates because our people need our utility to become more resilient to the risks of climate change. I'll show you an example, a project example where that exact thing happened. I would like to point out that local climate experts scored the highest on this, and just above state colleges and universities. So I felt pretty good about that. So when we go about doing a climate variability analysis to help our colleagues better understand what they're going to be facing in the name of climate hazards, we always begin with observed climate change. Why? This sets the baseline for the change and simultaneously educates them on what they're dealing with. A lot of people have anecdotal knowledge. It's the old farmer scenario in Nebraska. It's never done that before. I've never seen it do that before. Well, in this case, this is what we do. We help verify what's already going on in their head. It's like, you know what? We're seeing things we haven't seen before. That sets the baseline. Then we can have the discussion of climate projections. They're already seeing change. This is what the change is expected to do. This is what the best climate scientists in America think, or internationally think, is going to happen. And then finally, we use that information to do climate vulnerability and risk assessments and identify and assess climate impacts to infrastructure to strategize resiliency plans. This is something that I have always lived by, but never saw until about 5 years ago. A goal of forecasting is not to predict the future, but to tell you what you need to know to take meaningful action in the present. Interestingly enough, Dr. Paul Sappho is a technologist, not a meteorologist, but it is indeed very applicable to climate science. So this is an example of looking at observed climate trends. I made this I made this data up. No, I put this data together this morning. This is the annual precipitation in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia International Airport from 1949 to 2018. Notice the trend? Yeah, annual precipitation has gone up almost 7 inches in that time. Annual 24-hour maximum precipitation at Philly. In other words, the heaviest rain over a 24-hour period in every year from 1949 to 2018. Also, a significant upward tick with the 3 largest 24-hour rainfall events happening after 1997. This is a chart that I have done probably 50 different places in the United States, and only one showed a downward trend, and that was in the Southwest Desert. But everywhere else, that trend is increasing. Annual average daily maximum air temperature in Philly. So this is the average of the daily maximum temps. They have gone up almost 2.5 degrees in that same time period, and a representation of the urban heat island as well as climate change. The minimum air temperatures have gone up significantly. This is almost 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit in Philadelphia from 1949 to 2018. Observed changes in precipitation. This is actually from the National Climate Assessment 2018. They have found that the number of 1% of all daily events, in other words, that 100-year event, has increased its occurrence 71%, in which case it's probably not the 100-year event anymore, but it has particularly increased in the northeastern U.S. So here's a fun one for you guys to try at home, but I tried it on the group from North Carolina, and it actually played fairly well. So I asked him, I said, do you guys invest? And, you know, in the stock market, in bonds and mutual funds? And they're like, yeah. I go, well, who do you listen to? And they said, well, you know, majority of the cases they had a financial advisor. And I go, well, this is not a climate graph. This is the S&P 500 from 1919 to 2018. And you've probably been listening to your financial advisor saying that, hey, the S&P is going to go up over time. That is the same scenario that's playing itself out with climate scientists. They are telling you that climate change is real and temperature and is going to go up globally, and it's going to impact your local weather and climate. you could see a lot of faces that were like, yeah, this guy's all full of it. And then they came to the realization, it's like, wow, most of the time my financial advisors don't even have a degree, let alone more than 5 years of experience in the industry he's in. And I'm listening to him and betting my money on it. It's worth a shot. It's worth a shot, and pulling that card when you are in a climate argument with someone. So how do we being the Atmospheric Science Group at HDR, quantify risk and plan for climate resilience? Well, 10 years ago, we developed the first fledgling resiliency framework on how to enable our clients to do that. We are now in the fourth version of that, and I'm certain it will further evolve. We begin with the discovery and assessment of the vulnerabilities and consequences of both observed and future projections for climate. Once we gather all that data, we have the discussion with the client as well as policymakers on the strategy and planning and prioritization of what needs to be done in the name of infrastructure to make, to adapt to these threats of climate change. This is where continuity planning comes in, as well as sustainable solutions such as green infrastructure and low impact development. And then finally, you get to the reimagine, redesign stage. But funding that is unbelievably important. There are numerous avenues for grant funding, as well as other cost share funding from the federal government to enable adaptation efforts. Nicole had mentioned Florida Climate Institute. They put out a list every month of all the opportunities for grant funding in the name of climate resilience. And then we go on to the respond and execute phase, because emergency management is always part of the greater resiliency picture. So all emergency responders and long-term response plans are included into developing resilience. And then finally, you get to the control, adapt, and recover phase, which is where asset management fits in. But recovery you have to have a plan. We did a project in King County, Washington. Hand typed, and it was 15 years old. We said, well, we're gonna have to work on that a little bit. So in the first two phases, those are broken down into a six-step process to enable risk and resilience planning. You research, analyze, and present relevant hazards. You create an inventory of the infrastructure and identify at-risk infrastructure and systems. And by the way, this could also be used directly for community services as well, and we have. But in this case, it is directed towards infrastructure. Conduct vulnerability assessment of affected systems. Prioritize vulnerabilities. That's done through a risk scoring system. And then develop adaptation strategies to reduce vulnerability, and finally create and recommend adaptive actions. A question earlier was about what if scenarios. So in the discovery and assessment phase, we are trying to quantify risk so that we can use it to prioritize our risk mitigating and or adaptation actions. A risk analysis storm is one of the avenues for doing that. It's a resiliency review of critical infrastructure that was designed or built to criteria that has been identified as having a greater likelihood of being exceeded. So if you have Superstorm Sandy, which you see in that image right there, we can move it anywhere you want, model it, and make determinations as to what impacts that storm would have had it hit directly at your location. These what if scenarios are very effective. Used this 8 years ago was the first time I used a what if scenario, and it was on the flood warning system for Fairfax County, Virginia. And we took Tropical Storm Gaston and we placed it over Fairfax County, made it rain. Each one of these little grid squares that you see here is 5 minutes of rainfall added up into a storm total precipitation map. But we took the storm as it fell over Richmond, we put it over Fairfax County, we modeled it, and determined that 2 out of their 5 DL 566 dams that were for flood control would have breached. This was very moving for Fairfax County, and they understood what it meant. Several years after that, they did get a storm that ended up eroding the toe of one of those dams. What if scenarios are easy for policymakers to understand? They get it. We're using storms that are climatologically similar to ones that could fall right on the place we're looking at, and there's no reason why it didn't, other than that's just the way the storm fell. Once they see that kind of over-the-top response from that storm in their area, they're motivated to take adaptive actions. We did the same thing in Orange County Sanitation District capacity assessment. So they kept blowing manhole covers off in parts of their city, and then they had others that when they'd look at them, they could drop a rock and they'd hit dry earth on the bottom, and they could not figure it out. And so they brought us in. So we reconstructed using radar, 30 years worth of gauge-adjusted radar rainfall data, took the 12 biggest rainfall events in their service region, and then overlaid them over on top of each other. And lo and behold, hey, what do you know? The northwest side of their service region, this is Orange County, California, by the way. That's where Disneyland is. The northwestern side of their service area gets twice as much rain in the big storms as the southern portion of their service region. And it falls with greater intensity up here in a shorter amount of time. So we rebuilt their design event, and it was indeed still a 10-year rainfall event, but it was a 10-year rainfall event for this area just as much as it was for this area. Their old model was a one-size-fits-all, raining the same everywhere, and that's why they were having problems. In the end, we ended up adding climate projections to these rainfall intensities. So when they rebuild, which they do constantly, they will rebuild to a new standard that includes the impacts of climate change. City of Sarasota Climate Adaptation Plan. This was an interesting one because it was a total community involvement project. We looked at threats to water supply, wastewater, stormwater, transportation, healthcare, and recreation, and did a risk analysis of, I think it was 84 separate locations, and were able to enable them in the end to develop an adaptation plan that was prioritized to their greatest needs, then presented it to a city council meeting of 300 people. Not a single climate denier in the room. Every single one of those residents was engaged. They were sitting on the edge of their seats. They were listening to what was going on. And it was a spike the ball in the end zone moment from a climate scientist point of view. There are people that get it. They just aren't the ones that are in power right now. That will change. Another project, Puget Sound Water Forum. This was made up of the 4 major water supply utilities in the Puget Sound area. This is the project where I told you that we did a water supply resiliency study that came up with recommendations for infrastructure that would help them become more resilient. They took it to their local PUC and said, we'd like to build an intertie that enabled us to share our water across the utilities, and we're going to have to raise rates because of it. Well, needless to say, it made it, because in polling their own ratepayers put a very, very high belief in resilience activities and ensuring that they will have water supplies in the future. This was for seismic, climate, drought, and water quality, with, of course, in the Pacific Northwest, seismic being a big deal. So I promise you water supply, and wastewater, but why a wildfire resilience study? This is a study that we did. Wildfire, of course, being one of the consequences of increased air temperatures. And in this case, it profoundly affected the watersheds of the Chelan Public Utility District in the state of Washington. We did a economic analysis of what resiliency would do for them. We provided them with strategic decision support and modeled where their fires would occur, how bad they would be, and what infrastructure would be damaged because of it, all within a GIS framework. It was very effective, and we are continuing to work with them as a result of what happened with PG&E in California last year. They want to know if a fire starts out and if they are to blame for it, what are the consequences and what can they do on the resiliency side to adapt to that potential. We did a response, we did a resiliency study for King County Wastewater Treatment Division. But the part I really wanted to call out on this project, which was a very large project and included seismic as well as climate hazards, is that a resiliency plan is incomplete without a plan for response and recovery. This is something that went from 2 pages typed to 50 pages of great detail and is now an online tool that is used by King County. And then finally, Nicole, hopefully you're still on the line, but if you are not, hopefully you're smiling somewhere. In March 2018, HDR produced a resilience primer for EPTA. They came to us and they said, you know what? If we don't start at square one, no one's going to get this. So we produced a document that talked about why resilience is necessary, what it means to Florida in the long term, and what it's going to look like when projects start getting done. It was surprising, but we did a good job on it. And we are now working in Monroe County, Florida, providing them with a much more detailed view of what resilience, climate resilience is going to mean to their transportation assets. So that's it. I appreciate your guys' time. This image is not what you think it is. It's actually a railroad track. It is a railroad trestle that was there, and in September 2013, got washed away by a greater than 1,000-year event here in Colorado. UP did stop using the track, but kudos to whoever built the track, and not so much to whoever built the trestle.
Anybody in the room have any questions? I have a question. I'll just kick it off. I was really intrigued as a professional engineer myself. Your company's position that if your client is not willing to consider climate change, you have them sign some kind of an agreement. I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about, without obviously not naming names, but if you could talk a little bit about how that policy has gone over. I mean, have you needed to institute that policy? I mean, in other words, have a lot of clients said, no, we can't afford or don't want to think about climate change and we're willing to sign your waiver? Or has it been, you've never actually needed the waiver because when you present the facts the way you did here, most people get on board and say, well, it's a good idea. We should think about climate.
You asked the perfect question. In the case, in 90% of the cases, it's already a client that is on board and they know what they want and it's not a problem at all. We are just now, as in this week, experiencing situations where we're going to have to include that discussion within a scoping meeting, and we don't know what the client's going to say. So, as per your question, we're in situ right now in doing that. Our language is evolving in our legal team. You'll appreciate this. The legal team turned to the scientists to write the disclaimer. And I was like, shouldn't this be the other way around? And they said, no, we really want to hear what you have to say. So I wrote it, and they didn't change it. I was like, now I'm worried, guys. We're talking legal team, 8 to 10 lawyers. That this is all they do. And so it is kind of uncharted territory. We have not run into a client yet that said, no, I don't want it. It is, from a business standpoint, it gives us the opportunity to have that discussion. Where before it was like, I don't really want to mention it. And now it's like, no, you have to, because we want to reduce our risk and enable the client with the best information possible. So in answer to your question, we're right in the middle of it, right in the thick of it.
Yeah, and I'm actually curious if, the canon of ethics of professional engineers might prohibit you from not considering a factor that's going to put the public at risk, even if your client signs that piece of paper. I'm guessing, just because it's just.
Yeah, well, and it goes to, and this is the one that we had internally, the biggest problem, is identifying standard of care, which is, of course, the overlying rule of our business.
Yeah, very interesting. Go ahead.
I'm just sort of thinking out loud here right now. The insurance companies are up against the wall because of all the storm damage that they have to recover or cover. Would there be any advantage in ponying up them so that a company can't even qualify for more insurance or something if they don't sign this agreement? Have a little incentive there for them to want to sign this agreement, because if they don't, it might make them less acceptable to get more insurance. Does that make any sense?
And so that's interesting. That's exactly what goes on when you apply for an adaptation or mitigation grant. If you do that, you are agreeing basically to do that kind of analysis to make things happen. As far as FEMA funds go and other federal sources of aid, I do not think any of that language appears there.
But it is interesting. I'm involved in a resilience project in the Caribbean right now, and I've been interacting with a constituency that I don't usually interact with, which are yacht owners. And I learned that in the past few years, some of the major insurance companies have stopped insuring yachts that dock in certain portions of the Caribbean. And so they dock elsewhere now. In fact, it's created a lot more yachts down in the southern Caribbean because it's less hurricane prone. So there are some examples, I think, of where, these types of issues are now, the insurance companies, once they do their thing, it does trigger action. Just to your point, I think that's interesting.
Yeah, no, and I mean, State Farm pulled out of Florida, 5-6 years ago. Insurance companies, and the reason I mentioned it here, are going to be unbelievably strong drivers in what happens in the name of resilience. To the point where many coastal residents are going to have to post a bond because they're not going to be able to get insurance. We are one major, say Dorian hit Miami just as hard as it hit the Bahamas. It would be catastrophic from a humanitarian sense, of course, but financially, insurers would have to vacate. I mean, they just couldn't do it anymore. Or they make the rates so high that no one could afford them. We aren't too far away from that. I would say in the next 5 years, there will be places along the coast of the United States that are not insurable.
Interesting. I'll ask another question, because both of these presentations, in some sense, created an optimistic story, right? That, if you get the facts in front of the people, if you relay the personal stories to the decision makers, if you show the historical trends and do a what-if scenario, you're gonna win them over, and you're gonna get, 90% of the time they're gonna say, all right, we will consider climate. We're not gonna sign your waiver, right? Which is very much sort of in the face of what we're actually seeing politically, right? I mean, so if that's true,
Yeah.
then really we have sort of an absurd, and I'm not being glib, right? We have an absurd situation where the political decisions, which are supported by many people, not all people, maybe not even the majority of people, but a lot of people, are kind of not in sync with the rationality of folks who are actually in privy to the facts or privy to some data, even presented in one meeting or one workshop, as you said, right? So,
Yeah.
I wonder if you want to speak about that a little bit. I mean, obviously, it's just politics is politics and science is science, but both of these presentations suggested that science can change decisions if it's introduced and communicated in the right way. So what are we doing wrong?
As I mentioned earlier, at the very beginning of my presentation, and Nicole mentioned as well, changing policy has to happen before anything else can happen. Now, if policy is going in the wrong direction, and sorry, I'm going to brag on this one. When the current administration took over, I called our directors and I said, the amount of liability related to climate change is going to skyrocket to the point where it's going to be driving the bus, not the policy. So your comment regarding it's absurd. It is absurd, but what follows from that is unbelievably predictable, such as the number of civil lawsuits or civic lawsuits that are coming out because utilities and or cities and communities not doing what they should be doing in the name of climate resilience. That is going to continue and probably double if things do not change on the policy side. And by the way, that was Mike McMahon, not Mike McMahon of HCR.
Thank you for that. Are there any online questions? No?
But I have a question.
Go ahead.
Very non-technical question. I really enjoyed seeing all the work you've done across the country, and I would just like to hear if there are certain regions or parts of the country where you've gained inspiration in climate advocacy or movement, or on the other side, if there's areas regions of the country that you feel are just really, they're getting the facts and aren't really moving. So it's kind of a geographical perspective of which parts of the country are really moving on this stuff.
A great question. There's a two-part answer to it. One is primarily the coastal regions are experiencing the impacts of climate change sooner, particularly the Atlantic coast. Sea level rise on the Atlantic shores, just the observed trend, is 4 times what it is on the West Coast. Okay? But the West Coast is also experiencing greater climate variability when it comes to precipitation. So I do more water management and water resources management in California than I do anywhere else in the country. And it's because the climate variability has been it has such a great impact on the 40 million people that live in California. Now, with that said, it is much easier to talk climate change on both coasts. But I just got the first request for a proposal out of the city of Austin, Texas, that used the word climate change in the proposal. Now, Austin is a little more progressive than the rest of Texas, but it is a situation where they're being driven by fear of service failure. And if they don't do something, they're going to be the one holding the bag. And they don't want to be that. So where regionally it's driven by what the threats are. From a progressive standpoint, I'm seeing more and more interest in climate resilience in the central part of the country. Threats are different. Severe storms are the big driver, floods, and in the case of Texas, hurricanes. But it is a situation where I'm just glad it's not 5 years ago. We can have these conversations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else? All right, so thanks a lot, Michael. Thanks, Nicole, too. We should probably, there's not many people in the room, but we should give a round of a hand you know what I mean. Okay. Thanks very much. We'll be recording, we'll be posting this up onto the website, and we'll let you know when it's posted. And please feel free to join us first Wednesday of every month at the same time for more of these talks.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.